So, Silvia and Anumita, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start, and then as we continue, Silvia and I will probably we'll be sharing charts as well. I hope that's not too confusing for people. We've said how to not get lost in translation, because what we think is that it is very important to get all our ducks in a row, and before we start a project, so it's almost at the proposal stage that you need to start thinking about. Well, not almost, it's before the proposal that you need to start thinking about how you are going to get your linguistic needs in place, because this impacts on time and cost. So what are the things that you need to think of for this? Who is your target audience? Of course, it's normally the clients who will decide, but of course you can have an input. What's the topic? How, online, face-to-face, telephone, which of these methods are you going to use? And very importantly, recently I've realized with online, so much more so than, it is true for face-to-face, but for online as well, the tone of the brand is very, very important. So we're going to take you through each of these and tell you a little bit about the context. So the first thing is the target audience. So where are you going to do the research? The choice is normally made by the client, or at least suggested by the client, and then you put that into the proposal. The country selected has an impact on your research methodology, language, and of course time and cost.
So for example, in Switzerland, in Malaysia, you have different official languages, and depending on where your research takes place, this needs to be taken into consideration. In Switzerland, for example, there are various cantons that are officially bilingual or even trilingual, so double check whether you need translations for French, German, Italian, or even Romansh. In Malaysia, the government provides schooling at primary level in each of 3 major languages: Malay, Chinese, Mandarin, and Tamil. So always clarify with your recruiter, your panel provider, which languages you need. Also, some large European countries, for example, Germany, France, even the UK, they obviously have one official language, but they may nowadays run research in various languages in order to capture the information from large proportions of immigrants whose first language is not the country's official one. So it happens that in Germany, research may also take place in Turkish because of the large Turkish population.
Coming on to culture, this is an aside, though this is not relevant to language entirely. Culture is important to keep in mind.
So given more and more market research is done in markets where the culture is very different to British, European culture, we need to take this also into consideration when designing, organizing research. While something may work in the United Kingdom, it may currently not work in Saudi Arabia. For example, using a female moderator in a face-to-face discussion with a group of men, it's not going to work. So be considerate not to upset local customs culture.
On the other hand, in India, you can mix genders, especially amongst the youth. But for a majority of topics, single-sex groups work better. For example, for finance, technology, or even washing powders, because men don't wash clothes generally in India. However, if you were talking of technology among men and women, I've found middle-aged women less au fait with the language of technology than middle-aged men or younger women even. In online forums, therefore, we have to be able to speak both techie and layman, perhaps in the same forum or bulletin board. So we need to keep that in mind when we're doing translations. Moving on, talking about, I hope this is clear for you, because it doesn't come out very clear here. So we've lost a little bit in our typing as we moved from one screen to another. The languages and the scripts that the respondents speak, as well as the researchers speak, are very important. So because bilingual researchers come in various levels of bilinguality, I would say. Some can only speak the 2 languages. Some can speak the language and write in a Roman, that's the Western script. And the real bilinguals can speak, read, and write the local script, as well as, of course, the Roman script. So when I'm doing online in particular, it's very, very important that the bilingual researcher or multilingual researcher, whoever you're using, can speak, read, and write in the local script. It's not enough that they use Western script only. This is important in online and also, of course, anywhere where we need to read concepts. Otherwise, the local researcher, or not the local so much, the bilingual researcher can't actually read the concepts. So all this is relevant when you're designing the methodology of research, and also, of course, it impacts time and cost. Coming on to who we're talking to. Again, just what are we talking, what do they do? Who are these people? Is it a B2B study? Is it a consumer study? Is it doctors, insurance agents, techies, accountants, or are they mums? So all speak their own language, and especially the B2B have their own jargon. We need to be aware of this and choose our translators accordingly, because if there is a lot of jargon, we also need to involve our client in this. So we make sure that we use the words that they use in their industry worldwide. The next thing is about language proficiency. Now, we've touched upon this a little bit before. So saying that the moderator or the your bulletin board person has to be able to speak, read, and write. But the education level of the respondents is also very, very important. Of course, the more educated they are, the more proficient in the language. For instance, we can use High Hindi or Chinese with people who are more educated. In India also, people who are more educated will speak English, maybe after a fashion, but they will. In the US, for example, the less educated Latinos in California or Florida speak better Spanish than they would speak English. We talked about a lot of countries having research not just in their main language, but in the language of the immigrants. Now, the duration and the generation that immigrants have been in a particular country gives rise to bilinguals, but also this new people called no-linguals. These people are generally people who actually are not proficient in either their own language or the language of the country they're living in. And this simply happens because while they're able to speak their language because they speak it at home, they actually don't learn to read and write it. So it becomes quite difficult to decide which language to use with them. For instance, I just did a study last year among less educated South Asians, and we used quite a lot of difficult medical terms. Well, they weren't difficult, but not unheard of, particularly because they had medical issues. But a lot of them could not understand these in English, and these are South Asians born and brought up in the UK. They're second generation who think they are bilinguals, but in the end what you realize is that they actually don't speak any language that well. So in these kind of cases, you need a moderator who can actually speak both so that you can get the answers whichever way we can get them. English. Now, this is another thing we will touch upon later, but English is something that we can talk to people online, especially youth and techies, but a lot of things can be done in English, but sometimes it is very superficial. In a recent study, we used Hindi moderator. I was doing the work in Hindi, and we had an English moderator, and the participants were self-proclaimed proficient in English. However, what we realized that where we moderated in English, the responses were very limited and they weren't very clear, while the responses in Hindi were much more in-depth, and they also actually enjoyed the research much more. So again, it's very important to use a bilingual who is a researcher who is really bilingual. Again, what's the topic? B2B, financial, technical, and we talked about the jargons. So this has a big impact on the choice of translator, and it will also have an impact on your cost. In the context we just touched upon, online, telephone, face-to-face, as we go online, reading and writing a language and the specific script is very, very essential. Face-to-face and telephone, of course, specific language, speaking is sufficient unless you're showing concepts. this is another thing we realized, in that we must be able to use, the researcher must be able to use the Roman language as well as the local script when we're doing online, because what we realize is sometimes in local countries, they don't know how to use their local script when they're typing. So either we have to teach them, which is what I had to do in my last online project, in fact, to teach the respondents how to download this software to use their script, or we just used it in Roman script. So we were using both Roman script and the local language script on the same online forum, bulletin board. And this brand thing, of course, we've always kept in mind, as far as I am concerned, always kept in mind which brand are we kind of representing when we're doing research. But this has become, I feel, even more important when we're doing online research, as the role of research is sort of linked to PR. As we recruit people or talk to people and interview people who are actually brought in from clients' websites or Facebook pages or Twitter posts, the brand is very essential as we're speaking from the brand. So we have to recognize, is the brand formal? Is it informal? Is the brand deeply embedded in the country we're researching in? So do we have to use the local language? And what kind of language? Is it formal, informal? You can even use English, local language, or a mix of both. Really entirely depends on how the brand wants to be reflected. All this, again, will impact your choice of translators and even, of course, your moderators. So we need to tailor our language not only for respondents, or as we call them, participants online, but also for the brand we're representing. I recently did a study for a media group, and I had to use quite formal, polite Hindi, which comes naturally to me, of course, to reflect the purity of Hindi that the BBC use in India. And the respondents actually, or the participants, really appreciated that. Also, to encourage the Hindi-speaking respondents to participate more fully, I use quite flowery language and congratulatory words to motivate them to keep posting. So here again, that the level of language for a bilingual has to be really, really good to be able to, for the people also to recognize that they're speaking to somebody who is good at their language. Moving on to Silvia now.
So just a little bit of theory, nothing special. It is. Based on the Wolfram hypothesis, there is a basic idea that language can affect cognition and or influence our cognitive processes. So an individual's thoughts and actions are determined by the language or languages that this individual speaks. So market research is about understanding people and their thoughts, value systems, therefore getting the language right to ask questions as well as to understand the people is key to good market research. In market research, we want to dig deep, we're interested in what people like and dislike, we need to get it right, whether in a guide or questionnaire, in a survey interview, face-to-face interview or discussion. Therefore, we need to use the right language and subsequently the correct language, as well as use the appropriate people to do so, for example, native speakers. Moving on, what is translation? It's the process of translating content from one language into another. But we also need to make sure that the translation is actually adapted, localized into a relevant market or a country, so it works for the market researcher. Then what is interpretation? Interpretation requires you to first understand the piece of language and then give your explanation, the translation of it. So again, it is crucial that the interpreter has local knowledge and is a native speaker to make sure they can actually translate appropriately. So for example, it makes complete sense to the researchers and the clients in back rooms or on the phone. Moving on, as you can see, there's still a large online population that doesn't speak English, so translation is relevant to make sure we reach everyone in market research.
On the other hand, there is a large number of people who do or claim to speak and write English. And if they're communicating online by default, most of them are writing English. Remember though, this is self-proclaimed. The level of English really, really does vary. So while we can speak to most techies in this world in English, if we really want their in-depth views, we need to be able to probe in their language too. So I suggest that this might be the domain of us bilingual researchers, really.
Moving on, there are various qualitative and quantitative methodologies that require a different approach in how we write questions, and also will these questions work in other markets, in other languages. The linguist does not just need to translate, but also needs to have an understanding of market research. It's also worthwhile to ask your local recruiters to actually double check if the translation works in their relevant market, whether for face-to-face or Kawi, CATI, online qual, mobile, focus groups.
For quantitative questionnaires, I always ensure that back-checking is conducted by the translation agency, but also by the client's local offices. If they don't have local offices, I suggest they use internal resource to check the translation, or I have it done for them at my end as an additional check, because it's really essential that other than the translation agency, there is somebody else who is checking, particularly from the client side. Always ensure you give the translation agency enough time to do the translation. If the client is back-checking internally, I build in extra time, as client staff are often taking favors from local offices to get this done, and it is normally held up at their end. Many recruiters, so now just coming to qualitative, it's not always necessary to have bilingual, to have translation when the moderator is bilingual or the recruitment team is bilingual, when particularly the research is with consumers. Many recruiters are also bilingual, and if the questionnaire does not have attitude statements or any jargon that needs to be read out to respondents, there is no need to have a recruitment questionnaire translated to. If you're a bilingual moderator, especially who is a native speaker, it is not necessary to have a translated guide as well. As a bilingual moderator myself, I translate some of the colloquial terms or words I might forget in Hindi or Urdu, but not the whole guide. This is more true for consumer groups, of course, where we use everyday conversational language than B2B and technical groups in depth. I also agree this for when the moderator has been personally briefed by the research team and is writing the report and therefore has more stake in the project rather than only providing moderation. I also agree to this if I am traveling to the relevant country, so I can keep a close eye on how the research is going, and I'm sitting there with the simultaneous translator.
So target product profiles, messages, concepts also need to be translated. It's very crucial to have them translated, especially in healthcare market research where you want to avoid misunderstanding. It's also important that the local language is used when testing concepts and messages, as this is the language the local advertising product promotion will be done in. And this part of translation is very critical and needs to be given enough time to get right. And again, also back-checking is very important for this.
Often, now, the translator, I feel, really has to be familiar with the jargon that we use. Often I will ensure that clients organize this translation of the concepts, particularly for qualitative, and provides the keywords they use from their local offices in specific languages to get it back-checked in the local language via their own local offices. If the client is unfamiliar with the language or has no local office, I ensure that the translator is familiar with the relevant jargon. In the case of translating stimulus material, I ask the client to get their agency to provide this as far as possible, or I will use a translation agency which has links to advertising to get the copy as close to advertising copy as possible. A normal translator would not have the necessary copywriting skills to get this right. So we really need to make sure that the concepts are, as far as possible, done by the client with their ad agencies, or if we are using them, we use advertising copywriters who are translating. And this, again, has an impact on cost because they will be more expensive.
So moving on, if moderation, face-to-face interviewing is not done by a native or fully bilingual person, a lot of detail can also get lost. A lot of digging deep may not happen. So budget for local moderators and interviews, and check with your language partner with regards to availability of linguists. It's common to use English in key opinion leader research. In the majority of participant groups, it's actually best to do research in the local language in order to obtain meaningful answers.
As I mentioned earlier, we just did this online bulletin board recently in Hindi and a parallel one in English. And the English one was done with self-proclaimed English-speaking Indian respondents. The Hindi board, as I said, was more active, talkative, because they were familiar with the language and the fact they could express themselves without having to search for words. The English board was more bitty. Some respondents had good English, while some had to look for English words, or were actually using incorrect words or grammar, which really limited understanding of the issues. So therefore, it is essential that the respondent proficiency of the language is also understood and therefore used. Coming on to online. Having a bilingual researcher is best for these if you've got where you've got two different languages being used, or at least you need one who is able to understand English as well. However, bulletin board research should be conducted in the languages most familiar to respondents. Sometimes this can mean a mix of languages as well. Another critical element is the script used for online research and bulletin boards. For instance, Indians, Arabs, Chinese write in their own language and Roman letters as well. So we need to make sure that they are able to use the Roman script, that the moderator is able to use Roman script and the local language script as well.
So moving on, interpretation. Interpreting is a must if you want to follow interviews, discussions live, especially if your client wants top line immediately and you do not speak the local language. Again, use native speakers with local knowledge and market research understanding, and linguists who use appropriate terminology.
I always have simultaneous translators attend briefings and ensure that they have the guide in English and a copy of all the material and any translation if available. I also like to test the simultaneous translators' English before the groups and depths and brief them on how I want the translation. So for example, please explain context for local things mentioned, so local names, who are these people, what are their images, what is their image in the country, local brands, events, colloquial words. I sometimes ask them to write these down to explain later if the discussion is too fast and they can't explain it then and there. Some simultaneous translators are able to modulate their voices for moderators. So when the moderator's questioning, they modulate it in a certain way, and the respondent's answering, they'll modulate in a certain way. And some are even able to modulate their voices for different respondents, which is really useful. And it's a very useful shortcut, rather than when they say he said, she said, or that respondent said. The simultaneous translator is also a very useful first stop for top-line feedback. Sometimes they've done so much research that they're actually able to give you some good insights. Coming on to note-taking. I am doing a lot of this these days. I'm getting note takers in for almost all the research I do. If I'm moderating or viewing quick turnaround projects in any language, I ensure I have a note taker. Often the note takers are students. What I do is I make them sit in the room so that there is less loss. So I don't ask them to take notes of the simultaneous translation, but actually of the original language. They're students who are bilingual native speakers. It is essential to test their English skills. I feel there's always about 30% lost in note-taking or simultaneous translation. So if we do both simultaneous translation and note-taking, it works really well. As I said, we need to check their English skills because we don't want to lose 50% in the note-taking. Also, I prefer typed notes, but can accept handwritten notes if the note taker's translation skills are really exceptional, but they are slow typists. Of course, I test their handwriting first, because that can happen. Again, I brief the note taker in advance and provide them with the guide and materials so that they can prepare themselves. Some like to have the guide uploaded in their system so they don't have to write the questions. Others prefer to type everything. I like to have questions by moderator and answer by each respondent in a new line. It is good to brief them on how you like your notes, because they can do it. They can tailor it to the different researchers' needs. They are another source of verbatims and can explain local nuances. I ask them to write some typical local language words and phrases in language and Roman letters, and ask them to explain them to me in the notes. They're a good source of local understanding of local issues as well.
So also one more thing, make sure that your language service partner provides you with qualified note takers that are familiar with market research. Now, moving on, verbatims. They come from various sources, be it open-ended answers, online qual, bulletin boards, online scrapbooks, where there will be a lot of content and a wealth of languages. It's a lot easier for participants to write their answers in their native language, given a large majority won't speak English. If you have regular large verbatim volumes, check with your language service provider what's the fastest and the most cost-effective way to have them actually translated. Verbatims help to tell the story, so it's worth the investment.
In qualitative, I always ask the simultaneous translator to write down some verbatim words or sentences which are colloquial or in the local language, which explain things better than in English. After the group or depth, I write down the best way to pronounce these and write it down phonetically in English, so I might use it in the presentation.
Moving on, coding. Well, if you do not want to translate your open-ended answers, you can obviously use an experienced bilingual coder that can code directly from the foreign language into an English code frame, so to save time and cost. Again, check with your language partner that they only work actually with experienced coders. Moving on, you and your clients may require transcripts in local language but also translated into English, so be aware when costing. Some clients may even want both languages in one document, so always check with your translation provider what could be the most cost and time effective option, because every option may take longer or less. And you don't want to jeopardize the quality. When it comes to content analysis, very similar. Some clients prefer a very structured approach, as it's easier for them to write presentations. Hence, you will need bilingual speakers that have an understanding of the market research, analysis experience, the relevant topic, and are also familiar with the relevant technical terminology.
Some American clients I've noticed recently, they want notes and content analysis in one these days. These are best provided, I feel, by the local moderator or yourself if you are doing the research. So get something from the local moderator and you also have an input in them. Or else at least you make sure that if you are writing it and somebody else has moderated it, that they check, the local moderator checks.
Then we have reports or even presentations. Clients may require translation of a final report, given the stakeholders do not necessarily understand English. It may help your client to actually implement results better in a particular market.
Again, please ensure that the translator knows the jargon of the category, and have some random, I tend to do this, have some random or difficult bits of the report back translated, just to make sure that you've got everything right.
Now, you should be aware where translation is required, but in order to get it right, a few more practical tricks. Not everything we use in verbal language can actually be written down or vice versa, so this needs to be taken into consideration when translating a questionnaire guide. Also, depending on which regions market research takes place, we need to make sure it's understood correctly. There's Chinese, so we have Mandarin, Cantonese, and many more Chinese dialects spoken, and there's written, simplified, and traditional Chinese. So in some regions you use traditional Chinese, Hong Kong, for your surveys, and in others simplified Chinese, for example in China. So if it's not clear, your language partner should always query with you at voting stage. Moving on, from a time and cost perspective, it's also worthwhile actually to point out that Western language scripts like English, French obviously differ from Chinese, Arabic, Japanese, so it may take longer to translate. Also, there are standard languages like French, English, and more rare ones like Hebrew or Finnish. So some rare languages may take longer to be turned around, and it is not necessarily because the linguists work slower. It's mainly because rare languages are not covered by many linguists. Maybe that's why they're rare, and there are obviously even fewer that specialize in a particular field. So they're particularly busy as a group, and it actually takes a longer to place the work. So your translation partner should always make you aware of the time implications there may be when it comes to translation of different scripts or non-standard languages. Another important point would be proofreading and back translation. Just a short definition: proofreading means the translation is proofread by another translator, while back translation means the translation is actually translated back into the original source language. We should not always think that translation is bulletproof. Let's think about how many times a questionnaire guide may be looked at before you proof it. Imagine how many proofings this webinar went through. Sometimes, depending on complexity of text, or when several linguists have to translate one text to speed up the process, your language partner should recommend to use another translator to proofread, especially when results are going to be published or none of the market researchers on site actually speak the language to proofread. And just a few more practical tips. Yeah, we still have a bit more time. While we have in general more words when translating from English into Italian, there are fewer words translating text from from French, German back into English. When it comes to translating from Chinese, Japanese into English, actually the characters are counted, which is different to European languages where words are counted. So be aware when you budget. Then while in English we use a decimal point for currency, in French, German, we use a comma. So if currency measurements are not localized, translated correctly, it can lead to misinterpretation. For example, when reading numbers on target product profiles. Then addressing participants. Now, while you may use a more informal way of addressing some participants in some countries, languages, in others it may differ. So always make sure this is clarified. While we may say "Dear John" to a participant in the UK, in German and French, that's impolite. You have to address the person actually with the surname. Not that we should actually mention names in market research. So also this needs to be carried out for the entire questionnaire. This form needs to be used for the entire questionnaire or guide. It's also worth pointing out that while a question style may work in English, it may not work in other countries. Again, use translators, linguists who are aware of market research and local nuances. And we should also check whether we can actually run non-mobile, non-online research in other markets on the same days. Then, for example, in the UK, can we communicate on same days with local clients or others? While in Europe or US, in general, we work from Monday to Friday. The working week in most Arabic countries is actually from Sunday to Thursday.
In India, we work all the time, so you can do Saturday, Sunday, and the whole week as well.
Yeah. Now, we have actually all these points give you a better idea of what to look out for when you're planning to do research in various countries, languages, regions of the world. So the key to success is to work with a specialized language service partner because they understand your translation, your SimTrans needs, they only work with native speakers, they specialize in market research, they use latest technology to keep actually project costs low by making use of memory savings from your previous translation orders, they offer fast turnaround service without jeopardizing translation quality, they make your multilingual market research a smoother experience, they ask questions. So also plan ahead, so calculate sufficient time for translation, proofreading, link checking, have interpreters, moderators, coders, analysts organized in time by a language service provider, so everyone can work as cost and time effectively. A rush translation can be fatal because there is no time, if there's no time for proving, and once you're out in the field or even at reporting stage, if then mistakes get detected, that is no good. So also interpreters, moderators are generally busy. Plan ahead where you can ask your language partner to give relevant people heads up so they can actually pencil potential work in.
Google translation can be very, very inaccurate. I learned about this very, very recently when I was doing this Hindi project. So it is okay to, as a check, or to get some words here and there, but the grammar is really all over the place. And most of the time, the meaning is just not clear when you're using long sentences. So if you're not familiar with the language, there is no way you can make out if it's been accurately translated. So you are forewarned. It's fun to use Google Translate, but not really of much use.
So thank you very much for your time. We hope this was useful and you can apply some of our practical examples in your future international research projects. And we're open now for Q&A.
And we finished in time.
Yes.
Yes, indeed you have. Well done. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to change the screen over, so if you just bear with me a second, everyone. I'll just do that. Okay, so yeah, Q&A time. So if you would like to ask your questions by placing your comments and so on in the question area. So we have we're going to start with a question from Luca Mayer. Hi, Luca. And he says, so correct translation has to do very much with local cultural awareness, isn't it?
Yes, I would say so. If there is elements in the research where you really need a lot of local cultural awareness, it should be done there, or at least with people who are familiar with that country, as in they visit there often. Things change so quickly, especially if you're talking about brands, for instance. Things change so quickly nowadays, so you need to be sure that you get your local input.
Yeah, yeah. Silvia, do you have anything to say on that?
No. I think Anumita said it. I mean, again, I can speak. Let's say your local, your language provider should always have people, at these locations as well, because without a local knowledge, they can't translate, they can't interpret, they need to know what's going on, what's happening in certain markets, they need to know about grants, so they need to have that local knowledge in order to, to translate, to interpret properly.
I mean, how much does the local cultural issue, and I'm now thinking about language and that sort of local context, how does that influence something very simple like, okay, you've got a questionnaire, you've got it translated. What do you do normally to make sure that the translation is a good one? How would you pilot the thing? Do you share it with the client? I mean, how do you actually know that the translation is going to work if the language that it's in is not a language that you're familiar with?
Well, I can speak now as a former researcher and obviously also from the working in the language industry. So we would always obviously check with the client, either the local affiliate. So if you don't just have one client, if you have a local affiliate in that market, if you're aware of, make sure you share that with the affiliate, and they may have a better understanding. Sometimes here at Language Connect, we do have actually local clients. So we have one client, but then an affiliate that actually comes back and says, oh, I would maybe phrase it slightly differently because this is how it works in this particular region of that country, of where that affiliate is actually located. So I think if you have affiliate, speak to them, ask them. Obviously, your local moderator is also a good source. And if you do quant, you have a local panel provider. They're also happy to have a look at that.
Okay.
In terms of for qualitative, for instance, if you're doing recruitment questionnaires, I think that's where you need that local input. And when you're recruiting people, say by brand users, so often I will do a check online and put some of the brand names that I know of, and then send it to the field team that I have in India, for instance, and then they will put in the different names, or if I have a field team in UAE, they will put in the different brands that are relevant, for instance.
Just one more. I remember when I did healthcare market research that we would always go out, not just to outline, but to affiliate, to ask for actually country-specific drug lists, because they can vary from country to country. And if the translator, the moderator, doesn't have these available, it's not going to work, because a participant may not recognize a certain name. So again, this is something as a researcher to reach out to your affiliate if you can, and from a language side, make sure that the translator has actually access to the local brands.
Okay, we've now got a question from Liz Montgomery. I know Liz does a lot of international research, and she says in online research, whether it's a bulletin board or quant, participants sometimes use local text speak, and some translators seem to struggle with this. Have you got any tips on how to deal with this up front?
Yeah, what I had this in this online study that I did. If it's qual, you can just ask them what it means. I mean, that's the way, and it's a good way to do, because they love to explain themselves then. So, or somebody else will explain it to you, even if that person doesn't. So I tend to do that, and it's good learning. However, in quant, I would again, if you have a local panel provider, you would get them to code, break the code in that sense of this text speak.
Well, I guess if a translator sees the text speak, they don't understand it yet, they would have to come back to us, or we would then need to say to the client, can you ask the respondent again? We are not 100% sure. Yes. But again, that's why it's so important to have local translators that may be familiar also with that kind of jargon or text language people use in that country.
Yeah, and Luca's added an additional question here, and he says, but how do you deal with slang and dialect expressions if you're not very familiar with the local culture?
Well, that's where I think I mean, if you're working with bilingual, that person has to be there, they really have to be connected to that country. Or if you're losing a local moderator, you ask them. I mean, that's how I tend to work. In terms of quantitative, again, you will ask the local interviewers or panel companies.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I'm just emphasizing or repeating, that's why you need the native speakers, the local translators. So, because if you don't have that person in that relevant country or working out from that country, they will not understand. If they live somewhere else in another culture, they speak the language perfectly, but these nuances, the dialects, the slangs, they may not be familiar if they have lived in another country for many years.
Well, I'd like to ask a question because it relates to some of the sort of inquiries that come through to me, and this relates to sort of online research, bulletin boards, communities, forums, that sort of thing. If you have to run something in more than one country, which is becoming more common these days with online work, it's very tempting to use somebody who is based in the UK, because you've got that direct. Let's say it's Japanese for a country. They're based in the UK. They're Japanese, but they are based in the UK. They've been living in the UK for a long time. it's very tempting, isn't it, to use the local person because you can meet with them, you can discuss with them in a very different way, and also presumably they're a bit easier to find than somebody who's actually in Japan. So, any guidance on that sort of thing?
Well, just because somebody is living in another country doesn't mean that they're not connected. So what you need to make sure is, as that's why I kept emphasizing that they need to be able to read, write, and speak, of course, which normally a lot of people do a different language or their original language. So they need to be really connected to that country. And what I'm finding is like bilinguals, very often they will, first generation ones in particular, they will have their legs in the two countries that you're talking. So they'll be very connected to Japan. Maybe they visit 4 or 5 times a year, or they do lots of research there anyway. So they will know what's happening in the local. The advantage also, as you said, I mean, it's very tempting to use somebody in the UK, but also they have an international perspective. So that is where, because when you use a local moderator, you will get the local knowledge, but if you're doing an international project, sometimes they get lost in the localness of that project. As a moderator, they don't understand the wider international implications. So personally, I am used by my clients, especially when there's a lot of international work, because I can interpret the local information internationally as well. So it works both ways. And of course, I'm very embedded in India still. I've got houses there and I go there very often. So, yeah.
We'd all love to come over and join you in your house.
Next trip, I'll let you know.
We've got a comment in from Alan Love, or a question in from Alan Love, and he asks, how do you recognise and deal with irony and sarcasm? Something I think.
Well, again, I think it's in online, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I have sometimes pretended to be obtuse to that because, I'd rather not go off on a tangent. But if you know the other language, the second language, if you're bilingual, you will recognize it.
So this just comes back to your point earlier of making sure you've got somebody who is, let's say you've got a moderator, they need to be embedded in the country and the language and the culture, whether they live there or not. They need to be embedded. Therefore, they would understand the role of things like irony, sarcasm, and humour within that society, and there are going to be different rules in different parts of the world.
And also, if you've got somebody who's living in the UK but from another country, they will recognize the irony and sarcasm of UK people as well.
Yeah.
Which is higher than a lot of other countries.
Yes. So it's always that famous line that Americans don't understand irony, even though we speak the same language. I'm not sure it's ever true, but
it depends on the Americans and where they come from and their education.
Yeah. And we've just got another point coming from Liz, actually, who's basically saying that people need to understand the language currently in use locally, rather than, for example, translating a tech word where the English is actually used, and we know that a lot of new language that comes through very often from technology is just directly used rather than being translated into anything.
Yeah. This is where you need also, from a translation point of view, you need translators to make this cultural jump, not just translate what is there, think, okay, what is actually used in our language? Do we actually need to translate that? Is that a word commonly used? So that's very important.
Okay.
I had a study, just to give an example, I had a study one where they used really complicated Hindi, which people just don't use anymore. So you need to make sure that the language that you use is current, rather than also in Arabic as well. That happens. You can use classical Arabic, and then you have Arabic which is used in Morocco and Tunisia, which is different from the Arabic used in the Levant or the Middle East. So you need to be very careful of who you're talking to and who you use as a translator.
Yeah, so it's possibly like the translation comes back as looking rather Dickensian or something.
Yes. Yeah.
I've got a comment in earlier from Mike Chiguri. I mentioned something about the MRS earlier. Can I elaborate? Yes, of course I can. What I said about the MRS was that we, as the ICG, support the MRS's continuing professional development program. And therefore, for all of our events, whether they're online or live, we get them accredited. So all the webinars, lasting about an hour, have this accreditation. And it's part of the CPD program is to do a certain amount of formal training, and I think it's 14 hours a year. And I think you need to do 7 hours of informal training, and the informal could just be, reading Impact magazine or something. Whereas the 14 hours of formal need to be certificated, accredited, and so on. And what the ICG are trying to do is to provide everything you need to qualify for CPD over the course of a year, but for free. We're aiming to do one webinar a month, and we also have some live events, mostly in London, but we do some around the country. So we're trying to get to that 14 so that you don't have to come to London, for example, and also you don't have to pay for an MRS course, because I think that's probably part of what the CPD are trying to do. So that's just to fill in on that. Okay, well, look, I think we've got to the end of our questions, and we're coming to the end of our time. Could I just thank Silvia and Anumita for an excellent presentation. A lot of things in there that I'm sure many of us didn't know a lot about. I certainly didn't. And our next webinar is, we did a webinar last year called Microsoft Office for Indies, and it covered all the key applications. But we have a lot of questions on the e-group about Excel. So we've decided to hold another webinar with the same presenter, which is Rachel Crew from Frog Training. She was very well received last time. So it's on the 16th of July. It'll be 11 a.m. again, and it's Microsoft Excel for Indies. Now, if you have any specific questions or issues you would like to get covered in that webinar, then just write to me, let me know, and we'll pass that on. Okay. Thanks very much for joining us today. Again, thanks to Silvia and Anumita, and we'll see you all next time. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.